Once she signs the papers, we can move her out within a month, Ashley said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet hallway. And I froze with my hand still on the doorknob, my breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat, because I knew in that instant I was never supposed to hear those words, not like this, not standing in my own home at 3 in the afternoon when they both thought I wouldn't be back until dinner. I had left earlier that morning for what was supposed to be a routine doctor's appointment, nothing serious, just a follow-up, the kind you schedule and forget about, but it ended quicker than expected, and I remember thinking on the drive home how nice it would be to surprise them, maybe start dinner early, maybe set the table the way I used to when Daniel was still a boy who smiled when he saw his favorite meal waiting for him, and I even stopped by the grocery store to pick up fresh green beans and a small apple pie, the kind he used to love, and as I pulled into the driveway, everything looked normal, peaceful even, the curtains drawn just enough to let the afternoon light spill softly across the living room floor. Nothing out of place, nothing warning me that the life I thought I had was about to shift in a way I couldn't undo. I stepped inside quietly, setting my purse down on the small table by the door, and that's when I heard Ashley's voice from the kitchen, calm, controlled, the way she always sounded when she was explaining something important, and Daniel answered her, his tone hesitant, almost uncertain, which was strange because my son had never been uncertain as a child, not when he held my hand crossing the street, not when he told me he would always take care of me, but now there was something different in his voice, something that made me pause before announcing I was home, and then she said it, that sentence, the one that settled into my bones like cold air. And I didn't move, I didn't step forward, I didn't make a sound, because suddenly I understood that if I did, whatever truth was unfolding in that kitchen would disappear before I could see it clearly. Are you sure she'll agree? Daniel asked, and there was a softness there, a flicker of doubt that might have comforted me once, but not now, not after what I had just heard, and Ashley let out a quiet sigh, the kind that carries both patience and quiet authority. She trusts you, Daniel, she's always trusted you, just tell her it's for her own good, that the house is too much for her now, that it's safer this way. And I felt something inside me shift, not break, not yet, but move into a place I didn't recognize, a place where the warmth I had carried for years began to cool into something sharper, clearer, and I leaned slightly closer to the wall, as if proximity would somehow make the words less real, less final, but it didn't, it only made them clearer. I thought about the years I had spent in this house, the birthdays, the holidays, the quiet mornings with coffee by the window, the way Daniel used to sit at the kitchen counter doing his homework while I cooked, and how proud I had been when he brought Ashley home for the first time, how I had welcomed her, trusted her, believed that she would be someone who added to our family, not someone who would quietly reshape it into something I no longer recognized. And yet here I was, standing just outside the room where my future was being discussed as if I were not a person but a problem to be managed, a situation to be handled carefully and efficiently. We just need her signature, Ashley continued, and there was a finality in her voice that made my fingers tighten around the edge of the doorframe. After that, everything falls into place. And Daniel didn't respond right away, and for a moment a small fragile hope flickered inside me, that he would say no, that he would push back, that he would remember who I was to him, but instead he exhaled slowly and said, "Okay, if you think it's best." And that was the moment something settled in me, not anger, not even sadness, but a quiet understanding, the kind that doesn't demand tears or confrontation, the kind that simply observes and remembers, and I realized then that walking into that kitchen, announcing my presence, pretending I had heard nothing, would be the easiest thing to do. But it would also be the most dangerous, because it would mean giving up the one advantage I had just been handed without their knowledge. So I stayed where I was, silent, still, listening as the last pieces of their plan unfolded in calm, measured voices, and I let every word sink in, every detail, every assumption they made about me, about what I would do, about how easily I could be guided toward the life they had already decided for me. And when the conversation shifted to something lighter, something ordinary, as if nothing important had just been decided, I stepped back quietly, picked up my purse, and walked out the same way I had come in, closing the door without a sound, because in that moment, I understood something they didn't, something they hadn't planned for, something they would come to regret, that I had heard everything, and I was no longer the woman they thought I was. I did not go back inside right away. Instead, I sat in my car with the engine off and my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at the quiet street as if something out there might explain what I had just heard. But everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same neighbor walking his dog, the same breeze moving through the trees, the same world continuing as if nothing had shifted, And yet inside me something had. Something subtle but permanent, like a door closing without sound, and I realized that the life I thought I understood had been quietly rearranged without my knowledge. I stayed there longer than I meant to, replaying every word in my mind, not with panic, not with anger, but with a kind of careful attention, as if each sentence carried a meaning I needed to study, because I had always believed that people reveal who they truly are in moments they think no one is watching, and now I had seen something I could not unsee, something that demanded I stop trusting what I had been shown and start paying attention to what had been hidden. Eventually I stepped out of the car, smoothing my coat as if that small gesture could restore some sense of normalcy, and I walked back into the house, this time making sure my footsteps were heard. Letting the front door close with just enough sound to announce my presence, and almost immediately I heard movement in the kitchen, the quick shift of chairs, the change in tone, and when I entered, Ashley turned toward me with that familiar smile, warm, composed, practiced, the kind of smile that now felt less like kindness and more like a performance. "You are home early," she said, her voice light, as if the afternoon had been uneventful, as if nothing had just been decided in that very room, and Daniel looked up from the counter, offering a small, distracted smile, the kind that does not quite reach the eyes, and I realized then how much I had missed before, how many times I had accepted these small inconsistencies without question, choosing comfort over curiosity. "The appointment did not take long," I said evenly, placing the grocery bag on the counter, and I could feel Ashley's eyes briefly flicker to it, taking in the contents, calculating in that quiet way she always did. "I thought I would come home and start dinner," I added, keeping my tone steady, natural, as if I had not just heard them discussing my future like a logistical problem. And for a moment there was a silence, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough for me to notice, long enough to confirm that something had indeed shifted between us, even if they believed I remained unaware. "That is thoughtful," Ashley replied, already moving to take the bag from me. Her movements efficient, controlled. "You should not tire yourself out, though you have been doing too much lately." And there it was, subtle, almost gentle, but now unmistakable, the beginning of the narrative they intended to build, the careful framing of concern that would later justify their decisions, and I nodded slightly, as if I accepted it, as if I had not already seen where this was leading. Daniel avoided my gaze for most of that evening, speaking only when necessary, his responses short, distracted, and I watched him. In a way I had never done before, not as a mother looking at her son with familiarity and warmth, but as someone observing a person whose actions no longer aligned with the role he once held in my life. And it was not that he seemed cruel, not overtly, but there was a distance there, a quiet willingness to step back and let someone else lead, and that, I realized, was perhaps more unsettling than anything else. Dinner passed in a way that might have seemed normal to anyone else, small talk about the weather, about errands, about things that did not matter, and I played my part carefully, responding when spoken to, offering a smile when expected, all the while storing away every glance, every pause, every word that felt just slightly out of place, and as the evening settled into its usual rhythm, I felt something new take shape within me, not a plan yet, not even a decision, but an awareness, a clarity that I had not allowed myself before, and I understood that whatever came next would depend on how well I could see, how much I could notice, how quietly I could remain while everything around me continued as if nothing had changed. Later that night, as I stood alone in my room, I looked around at the space I had known for years, the familiar furniture, the framed photographs, the small details that once felt like anchors to a stable life, and I realized that none of it meant what I thought it did, not anymore, because meaning is not held in objects but in the people who share them, and if those people had changed, or perhaps if I had only just begun to see them clearly, then everything else had to be reconsidered as well. And I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, folding my hands in my lap, not in defeat, not in sorrow, but in quiet reflection, because for the first time, I was no longer reacting to my life as it unfolded. I was beginning to observe it, to understand it, and that, I suspected, would make all the difference in what I chose to do next. The next morning began like any other, and that was the strangest part, because nothing on the surface had changed, yet everything beneath it had shifted into something I could no longer ignore, and I moved through the kitchen with the same quiet routine I had followed for years, measuring coffee grounds, filling the kettle, setting a single cup on the counter, but this time I was not simply preparing breakfast. I was watching, noticing the way the house sounded, the way it felt, the subtle rhythms I had once taken for granted now standing out with a clarity that felt almost clinical, and when Ashley came downstairs, She greeted me with that same polished warmth, her voice soft, her expression composed, asking how I had slept as if she had not been part of a conversation that would have changed everything had I been the woman I used to be. And I answered her calmly, offering the same gentle tone she expected, because I understood now that my strength was not in reacting but in remaining exactly as they believed me to be. Daniel joined us shortly after, his movements slightly rushed, his tie not quite straight, and I watched as Ashley reached over to adjust it for him, a small, familiar gesture that once might have seemed affectionate, but now carried a different weight, a quiet reminder of where his attention and loyalty had settled. And he thanked her with a quick smile, barely glancing in my direction, and I realized how easily habits form, how naturally people fall into patterns that reveal more than their words ever could. "I was thinking," Ashley said as she poured herself coffee, her tone casual, almost thoughtful, "maybe we should start looking at ways to make things easier around the house." And I felt the words before I even processed them, like a distant echo of what I had already heard. And I nodded slightly, as if considering her suggestion. "For the first time." "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice light, curious, and she met my gaze with that same careful expression. "Just small things, less upkeep, fewer responsibilities. You have done so much for so long. It might be time to think about what is best for you." And Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, not speaking, not interrupting, just allowing her words to settle into the room as if they were reasonable, as if they were kind, and I saw then how this would unfold. Not with confrontation or force, but with suggestion, with gentle pressure, with a narrative built piece by piece until it felt like my own idea. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make my response feel measured. "I appreciate your concern," I said, and I meant it in a way they could not fully understand because I appreciated it now as information, as confirmation, as something that allowed me to see the path ahead with greater clarity. "But I am managing just fine." And Ashley smiled, not arguing, not pushing, just accepting the answer for now, and that, more than anything, told me she was patient, that she was willing to wait, to build her case slowly. And I realized I would have to be just as patient, if not more. The rest of the morning unfolded in quiet routine, Daniel leaving for work with a brief goodbye, Ashley tidying the kitchen with practiced efficiency, and I moved through the house with a new awareness, noticing small details I had overlooked before. The way certain documents were no longer where I remembered leaving them, the way Ashley's phone was always within reach, the way conversations seemed to pause when I entered a room and resume only after I left, and none of it was obvious on its own, none of it would have raised concern a week ago, but now each detail felt like a thread, and I could see how they might be woven together into something much larger. Later that afternoon, I sat in the living room with a book open in my lap, though I had not turned a page in several minutes, listening instead to the quiet hum of the house, and I thought about the years that had brought me here, the decisions I had made, the trust one had given freely, and I understood that what I was facing was not a single moment of betrayal but a gradual shift that I had only just begun to recognize, and that realization did not fill me with anger as I might have expected, but with something steadier, something more deliberate, a resolve that did not need to announce itself to be real. When Ashley passed through the room, she paused briefly, offering a polite smile, asking if I needed anything, and I shook my head, returning the smile with the same calm expression I had practiced all morning. And as she continued on her way, I watched her for just a moment longer than usual, not with suspicion, not with accusation, but with a quiet acknowledgement that I was finally seeing her clearly, not as the person I had hoped she was, but as the person she had shown herself to be when she believed no one was listening. And I closed my book gently, placing it on the table beside me, because I understood now that the story unfolding around me was not one I could afford to ignore, and if I wanted to remain in control of what came next, I would have to listen more carefully than ever before, not just to what was said, but to everything that was not. It was not one moment that revealed the truth to me, but many, small and scattered across time, details I had once dismissed now returning with a clarity that felt almost unforgiving, and as I sat there that afternoon, I began to revisit them one by one, not as memories filled with warmth, but as pieces of something I had failed to see, moments that had quietly pointed to a different reality all along. I remembered the first time Ashley suggested we change the guest room into something more useful, her tone light, her reasoning practical, and I had agreed without much thought, believing it was simply part of adjusting to a shared household. But now I recalled how quickly my things had been packed away, how easily space that had once been mine was repurposed without question, and how I had accepted it, telling myself it was only fair, that I did not need so much room, that families evolve, and yet that had been the first step, the first quiet shift I had allowed without understanding what it meant. Then there were the smaller things, the ones that seemed too insignificant to question at the time, like the way Ashley had started handling the mail, sorting it before I ever saw it, placing certain envelopes aside with a casual explanation that she was just trying to help, or the way she had offered to organize my paperwork, insisting it would make things easier for me, and I had been grateful, genuinely grateful, believing she was caring for me in a way that made life simpler, not realizing that each act of assistance was also an act of control, subtle, careful, never obvious enough to challenge, but consistent enough to shape the environment around me. I thought about the conversations that had shifted in tone over the past year, the gentle suggestions about downsizing, about simplifying, about considering what the future might look like if I did not have to worry about maintaining such a large house, and each time I had listened, nodded, sometimes even agreed in part, because the ideas themselves were not unreasonable, not on the surface, but what I had missed was the persistence behind them, the way they were repeated, refined, introduced. Again under slightly different circumstances, as if they were being planted carefully, waiting to take root. And then there was Daniel, my son, whose changes had been quieter, less deliberate, but no less significant, the way he had gradually stepped back from decisions that once would have involved both of us, the way he deferred to Ashley in matters that affected the household, not with resistance, not even with clear intention, but with a kind of passive acceptance that I had mistaken for harmony, when in truth it had been something else entirely, a slow shift in alignment that I had not questioned because it did not happen all at once. I remembered a Sunday afternoon not long ago when I had asked him about a repair in the house, something minor, a leaking faucet in the upstairs bathroom, and he had said he would take care of it, but days passed, then weeks, and eventually Ashley arranged for someone to fix it without mentioning it to me. And when I asked, she explained it as a convenience, a way to save Daniel time, and I had accepted that explanation, grateful for the help, not recognizing that it also meant decisions were being made without me, that my role in my own home was becoming less central, less necessary. Each memory unfolded into the next, forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore once seen, and I realized that what had happened in that kitchen was not a sudden betrayal, not a single moment of deception, but the result of a process that had been unfolding quietly for a long time, a process I had been part of without understanding it, because I had chosen to trust, to believe that kindness was genuine, that intentions were aligned with my own, and perhaps that had been my mistake, not trusting but doing so without question. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway, my steps measured, deliberate, and I paused for a moment outside the same kitchen where I had overheard their conversation, looking in at the familiar space that now felt different, not because it had changed but because I could no longer see it through the same lens, and I understood then that clarity, once gained, cannot be set aside, cannot be ignored, it remains steady and present, shaping every thought that follows. I did not feel anger as I might have expected, nor did I feel the urge to confront them, to demand explanations or force a reckoning, because I knew now that such reactions would only serve their advantage, would confirm their assumptions about me, and I had no intention of giving them that. Instead I felt something quieter, something more controlled, a sense of awareness that allowed me to step back and consider what had already been set in motion, and more importantly what I could still influence. As I turned away from the kitchen and continued down the hall, I realized that the past could not be changed, that the moments I had overlooked were now part of a pattern I could finally see, but the future, that was something else entirely, something that had not yet been decided, and for the first time since I had heard those words I felt not uncertainty, but a quiet steady resolve, because now that I understood what had been happening around me, I also understood that I was no longer moving through my life without awareness, and that alone changed everything. 2 days later, something shifted in a way that confirmed everything I had begun to understand, not through a dramatic confrontation or an obvious act, but through something far more revealing, a moment so ordinary that it would have passed unnoticed before, but now stood out with quiet precision, and it began with a phone call that was not meant for me. I was in the hallway, moving slowly toward the living room, when I heard Ashley speaking in a low voice from the study, the door slightly ajar. Her tone calm but purposeful, and I would have continued walking, respecting her privacy as I always had, but one sentence stopped me in place, not because it was loud but because it was deliberate. "Yes, we just need to make sure everything is ready before she signs," she said, and there was a pause, the kind that suggests someone on the other end was asking a question, and she responded without hesitation, "No, she does not suspect anything, Daniel will handle that part." And I felt that same stillness settle over me again. Not shock this time, but recognition, because this was no longer a possibility or a suspicion. It was confirmation, clear and undeniable. I did not move closer, I did not lean in, I did not need to hear every word, because what I had already heard was enough, and I stepped back quietly, retreating down the hallway with the same careful control I had practiced since that first afternoon, my steps measured, my breathing steady, as if maintaining that calm was the only thing keeping everything from unraveling too soon. Later that evening, I sat at the dining table with them, the three of us arranged in the same familiar positions, the same plates, the same routine, and yet the atmosphere felt subtly altered, not in a way they could detect, but in the way I experienced it, as if I were no longer part of the scene but observing it from just outside, noticing the way Ashley guided the conversation, steering it gently but firmly, bringing up topics that aligned with her intentions, mentioning an article she had read about retirement communities, describing them in terms that emphasized comfort and ease, painting a picture that sounded appealing, reasonable, almost inviting, and Daniel listened, nodding occasionally, adding small comments that supported her narrative, not forceful, not insistent, but consistent enough to reinforce the idea. "It is just something to think about," she said, her voice soft, her expression thoughtful, and she glanced at me with that same carefully measured concern. "You deserve to enjoy your time without worrying about a house this size." And I met her gaze calmly, allowing a small smile to form, the kind that suggested I was considering her words without fully committing to them. "I have lived here for a long time," I replied, my tone even reflective. "I am quite comfortable." And she nodded, as if accepting that answer, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the patience, the understanding that this was not a conversation meant to be resolved in a single evening, but one that would unfold gradually, step by step. After dinner, as I cleared the table, I noticed something else, something small but significant. A folder placed neatly on the corner of the counter, not hidden, not concealed, but positioned in a way that suggested it belonged there, as if it were simply part of the household, and I might not have paid attention to it before, but now I did, and as Ashley stepped out of the room to take a call, I allowed myself a brief glance, just enough to register what it was: documents neatly organized, labeled in a way that made their purpose clear without needing to read every detail, and I felt a quiet understanding settle into place. Because this was not a plan in its early stages, it was something already in motion, something prepared, waiting for the final step. I did not touch the folder, I did not open it, I simply noted its presence and continued with what I was doing, because I understood that my role now was not to interrupt, not to reveal what I knew, but to observe, to gather, to ensure that when the time came, I would not be reacting without information, without clarity, without control. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I allowed myself a moment to reflect, not on what they were doing because that had become clear, but on what I would do next, and I realized that the advantage I held was not in confronting them, not in exposing their intentions prematurely, but in the fact that they believed I was unaware, that they were moving forward under the assumption that I would follow the path they had prepared, and that assumption, I understood, was the one thing I could use, the one thing that gave me space to think, to plan, to decide carefully rather than react impulsively. I looked around the room again, the same familiar walls, the same quiet presence of a life built over decades, and I understood that whatever they intended to take from me was not just a house, not just a physical space, but something far more personal, something tied to memory, to identity, to the life I had created long before they ever stepped into it. And I knew then that I would not allow that to be taken without understanding exactly how and why it was happening, and more importantly, without deciding for myself what the outcome would be, because for the first time, I was no longer moving through this situation blindly. I was seeing it clearly, and that clarity, I realized, was something they had not accounted for. The following morning, I did something I had not done in years. I woke up before anyone else in the house, not because I could not sleep, but because I needed the quiet, the kind of silence that allows thoughts to settle into something clear and usable, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, not drinking it right away, just holding it, feeling the warmth in my hands as I considered what came next, because for the first time, I was not simply reacting to what was happening around me, I was deciding how I would move within it. I understood now that time was not on their side as much as they believed, because their plan depended on my ignorance, on my willingness to trust without question, and that had already changed, which meant every step they took from this point forward would be built on an assumption that was no longer true, and that realization brought with it a quiet sense of control, not over them, not yet, but over myself, over how I would respond, how I would prepare, how I would ensure that I was no longer in a position where decisions about my life could be made without my full awareness. When Ashley came into the kitchen later that morning, she paused slightly when she saw me already there, as if adjusting to a detail that did not fit her expectations, and she smiled, that same composed expression, asking if I was feeling all right, and I nodded, returning the smile with the same calm steadiness I had practiced. "I just woke up early," I said. And that was true, but it was not the whole truth, because what I had really done was step into a different role, one where I was no longer simply part of the household but an observer within it. Over the next few days I began to make small changes, nothing noticeable, nothing that would draw attention, but enough to give me a clearer understanding of what was happening around me. I organized my own documents, quietly ensuring that everything important was accounted for. I reviewed accounts and records I had not looked at closely in some time, not because I had ever doubted their accuracy, but because I had never felt the need to question them, and now I did, and as I went through each detail I felt a growing sense of clarity, not alarm, not panic, but a steady awareness of where things stood and what might need to be adjusted. I also paid closer attention to conversations, not just the words themselves, but the timing, the context, the way certain topics were introduced and then set aside, only to return later in a slightly different form, and I noticed how often Ashley guided those conversations, how naturally she framed ideas in a way that made them seem reasonable, even beneficial, and I began to see the pattern more clearly, the structure beneath the surface, and understanding that structure made it easier to anticipate what might come next. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed increasingly distant, not in a way that was openly cold, but in a way that suggested he was avoiding something, perhaps even himself, and I watched him carefully, not with judgment but with a kind of quiet recognition, because I could see that whatever role he was playing in this situation, it was not one he fully controlled, and that did not excuse it, but it did explain it, and understanding that difference allowed me to remain steady rather than reactive. One afternoon I took a short drive, nothing unusual, just a trip into town under the pretense of running errands, and as I sat in my car in a parking lot a few miles from the house, I allowed myself a moment to think without interruption, to consider not just what they were planning, but what I needed to do in response, and I realized that the most important step was not immediate action, not confrontation, but preparation, ensuring that I had all the information I needed before making any decision, because once a decision was made, it would set everything else in motion. When I returned home, everything appeared as it always did, the same quiet order, the same routine, and Ashley greeted me with her usual warmth, asking if I had found everything I needed, and I nodded, offering a simple answer, because I understood now that simplicity was its own form of protection, that the less I revealed, the more space I had to observe, to think, to plan. That evening, as I sat in my room once again, I did not feel the uncertainty that had followed me in the days before. Instead I felt something more defined, a sense that I was no longer waiting for something to happen, but actively preparing for what would come, and I understood that whatever they believed about me, whatever assumptions they had made, those assumptions were now working in my favor, because they did not see me as someone who would question, who would notice, who would act, and that, I realized, was the one thing they had miscalculated, the one detail they had overlooked, and as I turned off the light and sat in the quiet darkness, I knew that the next steps would not be rushed, they would not be obvious, but they would be deliberate, because I was no longer moving through this situation without awareness, and that meant I was no longer powerless within it. By the end of that week, I no longer needed to guess what they were planning. I could see the shape of it clearly, not because they had told me directly, but because their actions had become consistent, almost predictable, and what surprised me most was not what they were doing, but how confident they seemed in doing it, as if the outcome had already been decided and all that remained was guiding me gently toward it. It started with small suggestions, becoming slightly more direct, Ashley mentioning specific places she had looked into, describing them in careful detail, communities designed for people my age, places with walking paths and organized activities, places that sounded peaceful, almost idyllic, but always framed with the same underlying message that staying here was no longer practical, that moving on would be better for me, and each time she spoke, Daniel would nod in quiet agreement, adding just enough support to make her words feel reinforced, even when he said very little himself. I responded the same way I had in the days before, with calm acknowledgement, with polite consideration, never dismissing their suggestions outright, but never agreeing either, And I could see that this unsettled Ashley more than resistance would have, because she expected either compliance or objection, something she could work with, something she could respond to, but what she received instead was stillness, a quiet neutrality that gave her nothing to adjust, nothing to counter, and that uncertainty, I realized, was something she was not accustomed to. One afternoon as I sat in the living room, I overheard another conversation, this time between the two of them, not as hidden as before, but still carried in lowered voices, and Daniel asked a question that lingered with me long after. What if she changes her mind? And there was a brief pause before Ashley answered, her tone steady, assured. She will not, she has always trusted you, that is not going to change now. And I understood then that her confidence was built on a version of me that no longer existed, a version that would accept what was presented without question, that would follow the path laid out without stopping to examine it. And that realization did not anger me, it clarified something, it showed me exactly where their plan depended on me remaining the same, and that meant that any change, no matter how subtle, shifted the entire structure. That evening I made another small decision, one that did not require confrontation or explanation, but carried its own quiet significance. I began to limit what I shared, not in a way that was obvious but in the way I answered questions, in the details I chose to include or leave out, and I noticed how quickly Ashley adjusted, how she began to ask more specific questions, seeking the information she had grown used to receiving freely, and I responded carefully, giving just enough to maintain the appearance of openness, but holding back what was no longer necessary to share. And in doing so, I felt the balance shift, not dramatically, not in a way that could be seen from the outside, but in a way that I could feel, a subtle reorientation of control. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed increasingly caught between two roles, the one he had grown into and the one he had once held, and there were moments, brief and almost imperceptible, when I saw hesitation in him, a flicker of something that might have been doubt, but it never lasted long enough to become action, and I realized that whatever conflict existed within him, it was not something he was prepared to face directly, and that meant I could not rely on him to change the course of what was happening, not now, not in the way I might have once hoped. Instead, I focused on what I could control, the information I gathered, the way I presented myself, the pace at which I moved through each interaction, and I understood that patience was no longer just a virtue. It was a strategy, one that required consistency, attention, and restraint, because acting too soon, revealing too much, would only return the advantage to them. As the days continued, I noticed that the pressure began to increase, not in intensity but in frequency, the suggestions appearing more often, the conversations circling back to the same topics with greater regularity, and I knew that they were preparing for something, that they believed the moment to act was approaching, and I allowed that belief to remain unchallenged because it served me just as much as it served them. That night, as I sat once again in the quiet of my room, I reflected on how much had changed in such a short time, not in the house itself, not in the routines we followed, but in the way I moved within it, in the way I listened, in the way I understood what was happening around me, and I realized that the greatest shift had not been in them but in me, because I was no longer seeing my life through the lens of assumption. I was seeing it as it was, and that clarity, that steady, unshaken awareness, was something they had not prepared for, something they could not account for. And as I sat there in the stillness, I knew that whatever came next, I would meet it not with surprise, but with understanding, and that made all the difference. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind of afternoon that would have once passed without leaving any impression at all, but now every moment seemed to carry weight, and I was sitting at the dining table with a cup of tea when Ashley walked in holding a thin stack of papers, her expression composed, almost gentle, as if she had rehearsed the exact balance between concern and reassurance, and I knew before she even spoke that this was the moment they had been preparing for. "I wanted to go over something with you," she said, placing the papers carefully on the table, aligning them neatly as if their order mattered, and I looked at them without reaching out, allowing a brief pause to settle between us, because I understood now that timing was just as important as words, and she continued, her voice soft, measured. "We have been thinking about ways to make things easier for you, to give you more freedom without the burden of maintaining such a large home." And Daniel appeared in the doorway behind her, not stepping fully into the room, just standing there, present but distant, as if he had chosen a position that required the least amount of direct involvement. I nodded slowly, as if this was a new conversation, as if I had not heard every piece of it unfolding over the past week, and I let my gaze move from the papers to Ashley's face, then briefly to Daniel's, noticing the way he avoided eye contact, the way his posture suggested discomfort without action, and I realized that this moment, while important to them, was not one they approached with complete confidence, because even they understood on some level that what they were asking could not be undone once it was accepted. "What is it exactly?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, curious, and Ashley smiled slightly, relieved perhaps that I had not resisted immediately, and she began to explain, describing the documents as a way to simplify responsibilities, to ensure everything is properly managed, using language that framed the decision as practical, even beneficial, and as she spoke I listened carefully, not just to the content, but to the structure of her explanation, the way she emphasized certain points while softening others, the way she positioned the outcome as something that would naturally follow from the situation she had described. And I recognized the pattern now, the same pattern I had seen in smaller conversations, only this time it was more defined, more deliberate. I reached out then, finally, and placed my hand lightly on the top page, not turning it, not reading it yet, just acknowledging its presence, and I let a moment pass before speaking again. "You have put a lot of thought into this," I said, and it was not a question, and Ashley nodded, her expression steady. "We just want what is best for you," she replied, and I held her gaze for a second longer than usual, not with confrontation but with quiet awareness, because I understood now that what she believed was best and what I would choose for myself were not necessarily the same. I turned the first page slowly, scanning the text without appearing to study it too closely, and I could feel both of them watching me, waiting for a reaction, waiting for a signal that would tell them which direction this moment would take, and I kept my expression neutral, thoughtful, as if I were considering something new, something unfamiliar, even though every part of me already understood what this represented, and I nodded slightly, closing the folder with the same careful motion. "I will need some time to look through this properly," I said, my voice steady, measured, and there was a brief flicker in Ashley's expression, not disappointment, not frustration, but something closer to recalibration, as if she were adjusting her expectations in real time. "Of course," she said quickly, recovering her composure. "Take all the time you need." And Daniel finally stepped forward slightly, offering a small, supportive nod, but still not speaking, and I realized that his silence was as much a part of this moment as anything else, because it confirmed what I had already seen, that he was present but not leading, involved but not directing, and that understanding settled into place with a quiet certainty. I stood up then, picking up the folder, holding it with both hands as if it were simply another document among many, and I gave them both a small, polite smile, the kind that suggested everything was proceeding as expected. "I will read it later," I said, and I turned toward the hallway, walking away at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, just steady, controlled, and as I reached my room and closed the door behind me, I allowed myself a single, measured breath, not of relief, not of anxiety, but of recognition, because this was the moment their plan had moved from preparation to action, and they believed it was only a matter of time before I would follow through, before I would sign, before everything would fall into place exactly as they intended. I set the folder down on the desk and looked at it for a long moment, not opening it again, not yet, because I understood that what mattered was not what was written on those pages, but what I would choose to do with them, and as I stood there in the quiet, I realized that they were still operating under the same assumption, that I was unaware, that I would trust, that I would accept, and that assumption, more than anything else, was the one thing that gave me the space to decide my next move with complete clarity, because while they believed this was the beginning of the end, I knew it was only the point at which everything could change. That night, I did not open the folder right away. Instead, I sat in the chair by the window and let the quiet settle around me, the same quiet that had once felt comforting now carrying a different weight, not heavy but deliberate, as if every moment was asking me to decide who I would be moving forward. And I understood that what lay inside those pages was not just paperwork, it was an expectation, a carefully constructed outcome waiting for my agreement. And the most important thing was not how quickly I responded, but how clearly I understood what that response needed to be. When I finally opened the folder, I read each page slowly, not skimming, not rushing, taking in every detail with the same careful attention I had given to everything else over the past days, and it was exactly what I had expected, language designed to appear reasonable, structured to feel protective, but ultimately leading to one conclusion: a transfer of control, a shift that would place decisions about my life into hands that were no longer acting in my interest. And as I read, I felt no confusion, no hesitation, only confirmation, because this was not something I was seeing for the first time, It was something I had already understood now. Simply presented in formal terms, I closed the folder and placed it back on the desk, aligning it neatly as Ashley had done earlier, and I sat there for a moment longer, not thinking about what they wanted but about what I needed, and for the first time that answer felt clear, not complicated, not uncertain, but steady and firm, because I was no longer trying to preserve an image of family that no longer existed. I was deciding how to protect what still belonged to me. The next morning I followed my usual routine, nothing out of place, nothing to suggest that anything had changed, and when Ashley asked if I had a chance to look at the documents, I nodded calmly. I did, I said, keeping my tone even, and she watched me closely, waiting, and I added, I have a few questions. I think it would be best if I reviewed them with someone before making any decisions. And there was a brief pause, subtle but unmistakable, and I saw it then, the first sign that something had not gone according to plan, not alarm, not panic, but a moment of recalculation, as if she were adjusting to a variable she had not anticipated. Of course, she said, her voice still composed but slightly more careful now, that makes sense. And Daniel, standing nearby, shifted slightly, his expression uncertain, and for the first time, he looked directly at me, not with confidence, not with reassurance, but with something else, something closer to realization. And I held his gaze for a moment, not accusing, not questioning, just steady, because I wanted him to understand without words that I was no longer unaware. That afternoon I left the house again, just as I had before, under the same simple pretense of errands, but this time my destination was clear, and as I drove, I felt a sense of calm that had not been there before, not because the situation had resolved itself, but because I had stepped into it with intention, with awareness, with a decision that was entirely my own, and I understood that whatever came next would not be something I reacted to, it would be something I had already prepared for. When I returned home later that day, the house felt the same quiet order, the same familiar arrangement of furniture and light, but I knew now that the balance within it had shifted, not in a way they could see yet, but in a way that would become clear in time, because the assumption they had built everything on, the belief that I would follow the path they had laid out without question, was no longer true, and that meant their plan, no matter how carefully constructed, was no longer secure. That evening, as we sat together once again, the conversation felt different, not in content but in tone, in the subtle awareness that something had changed, and Ashley spoke a little more cautiously, Daniel a little more quietly, and I remained exactly as I had been, calm, composed, present, because I understood that there was no need to rush, no need to reveal anything before it was necessary, and as I looked at them across the table, I realized that the power in this situation had never been about control over others. It had always been about clarity, about knowing what was true and acting from that place, and now that I had that clarity, everything else would follow. Later that night, as I stood once more by the window, looking out at the same quiet street, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of victory, not of satisfaction, but of understanding, because they had believed they were guiding me toward an outcome I would accept without question, and they had been very careful, very deliberate, but they had made one mistake, one assumption that changed everything. They believed I was still the woman who trusted without seeing, and that was no longer true.